Okay, everybody, welcome to episode 2 of Cancel Culture Club, in which I and whoever else cares to join me discuss issues of cancel culture, especially particular episodes of it, and give our thoughts on whether a particular cancellation incident or incidents make any damn sense. So, once again, joining me is my esteemed friend, Charles Boyd. And Charles, thanks for joining me yet again.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
So let's just dive right in. This time, I wanted to tackle the example of Whoopi Goldberg and her still ongoing 2-week suspension from The View. Her job, I guess co-hosting technically, but sort of the chief co-host of The View, which I believe is the top-rated daytime talk show, if memory serves, in the United States, and has been for some years, and she's been co-hosting it for some years. Obviously, what elicited this was a remark she made in the course of a discussion about the Holocaust, specifically a move by a school board in the heartland that actually was removing Mouse, that graphic novel for teenagers, from its list of required readings, I think. That's raised concerns about, are certain parts of the country trying to suppress discussion of things like racism, anti-Semitism, etc. And in the course of that conversation, in an episode that I was watching, mind you, she said, the Holocaust is not about race.
Well, also, if you're going to do this, then let's be truthful about it, because the Holocaust isn't about race. No, it's not about race.
It is.
No, it's about
a different race.
But it's not about race. It's not about race.
What is it about?
Because it's about man's inhumanity to man. That's what it's about.
But it's about white supremacy. It's about
but
going after
it's
Jews
not about
ideal race.
But these are two white groups of people.
Well, how do we have to black people
see them as white?
But you're missing the point. You're missing the point. The minute you turn it into race, it goes down this alley. Let's talk about it for what it is. It's how people treat each other.
That created a brief but intense storm of controversy. I think later that same night, she appeared on Stephen Colbert's show and sort of started to walk back her remark.
As a Black person, I think of race as being something that I can see. So I see you and I know what race you are. And the discussion was about how I felt about that.
And the next morning on The View, the next episode of The View, she introduced that episode by giving a lengthy apology for her remark, admitting that she had been mistaken.
I said something that I feel a responsibility for not leaving unexamined, because my words upset so many people, which was never my intention. And I understand why.
She seemed to be alluding to a common misconception that if someone is perpetrating some form of anti-Semitism, that it must be about religion. Whereas in reality, the Nazis' anti-Semitism was explicitly racial, not religious. And Hitler didn't really care about religion one way or the other. In his heart of hearts, he considered the Jews to be a separate race and an inferior one, etc. And that drove the Nazis' campaign of genocide against the Jews of Europe. And she sort of conceded this. They had, I think, Jonathan Greenblatt, the head of the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, on the show to discuss the issue and explain where she went wrong in her analysis.
Hitler's ideology, the Third Reich, was predicated on the idea that the Aryans, the Germans, were a, quote, master race, and the Jews were a subhuman race. It was a racialized anti-Semitism.
She gave what seemed like a pretty sincere apology. I thought the matter would end there. Imagine my surprise when it was announced that she was actually going to be suspended for 2 weeks. I didn't see that coming. Did you anticipate that particular move? Because I think that's where the main controversy lies. Not just that she was criticized for saying it, but that she was suspended for 2 weeks.
Yeah, I didn't see it coming either, because for one thing, her original comments, they were off base, but they, as best I could tell, she was not making any attempt to downplay how horrible the Holocaust was. In other words, she wasn't attempting to say that it was somehow less bad because in her mind it wasn't about race. It seemed like she was sort of trying to make sort of a larger point as kind of a criticism of conservatives, because she said it, I believe, in the context of actually trying to defend the book Mouse, not to downplay the seriousness of the Holocaust. And again, that's not to defend what she said. It's clear that her knowledge of the history of the Holocaust and Jewish history generally was kind of lacking. but I would, but given the obviously non-malicious intent behind what she said, I was surprised that the network handled it the way they did. The other reason it surprised me is that, as best I'm aware, I don't think that this was a situation where any large Jewish organizations were actually trying to get her to face professional consequences. It doesn't seem like there was some sort of campaign going to get her fired or suspended. So that really did kind of surprise me. And the third reason it surprised me, honestly, is I mean, she's said, I like Whoopi Goldberg. Like I've enjoyed a lot of her work for the last 20 years, but she has made much more offensive comments than that, that are much harder to sort of chalk up to being innocently insensitive. I mean the Roman Polanski thing. Well, first of all, if she'd made that comment in 2022, she might have gotten suspended or fired. But like the comment she made at Roman Polanski, like I remember being kind of thunderstruck when she said that because of just how offensive those comments were. So it just surprised me that the network reacted, so strongly. Now, I mean, granted, 2-week suspension, not the same as firing. It's not the same as like a 6-month suspension. But yeah, I was kind of taken aback by how the network handled this, and I'm still not entirely sure why they did it.
Funny that you should mention the Roman Polanski incident. I want to say that was back in maybe 2009, thereabouts. I remember that raising a lot of eyebrows as well, because this concerned Roman Polanski's, I think, 1977 sexual assault offense against, I think, a 13-year-old girl at the time. I remember Whoopi Goldberg apparently said what he was accused of wasn't rape, I think is the way that she phrased it at the time. And I agree with you. If she had said that in the post-Me Too era, she would have faced much stiffer consequences. In this case, I wouldn't even necessarily couch it in terms of her intent and whether it was malicious or not. You're absolutely right that her intent was not malicious. And like you say, she said this in the context or in the course of trying to point out the importance of teaching about the Holocaust and other similar historical episodes of oppression and persecution of marginalized populations in schools. So it wasn't as if she was trying to downplay or trivialize the Holocaust. You're quite right. And I think that's the case, no matter whether you consider her subjective intent or not, even if you only look at the words that came out of her mouth, even if you don't consider her body language or vocal tone or facial expression or any of that, and you just read a transcript of what she said, on its face, while potentially problematic in the sense that, anytime you look at a historical instance of oppression, it could be the Holocaust, it could be the enslavement of African Americans or other African descendants, it could be, the Armenian genocide or any number of other instances one could name. If you misidentify the cause of it, especially the ideological cause of it, as she did in this case, there's always the potential for that to cause problems elsewhere, right? If too many people buy into that misconception, they may totally misunderstand the significance of that historical event. What she said was definitely erroneous, and it wasn't harmless, what in the legal field they call harmless error. This is important, relevant, significant error that needed to be corrected.
I don't believe in cancel culture. I like the phrase that my friend Nick Cannon uses. We need counsel culture. We shouldn't cancel Whoopi because she made a mistake, even if she made the mistake again on Colbert.
I thought that the way the show itself handled it, the way she handled it, both in appearing on Stephen Colbert's show that night and discussing the issue and apologizing for what she said the next morning, I thought that was really all, as far as it needed to go. I thought that was where the matter really should have ended. I don't know if you think there was anything more that she might have needed to do or might have been well advised to do.
I don't think so, really. I mean, honestly, I would say that she said something problematic. She apologized, and the thing that she said really didn't rise to the level of needing to do essentially massive amounts of penance. I think that the amount of penance that she'd done was really pretty adequate. And I think that you also can run the risk, if it was a fairly mild mistake that you made, I mean, I don't want to trivialize it, but if it's a relatively mild mistake that you make and you do a really over the top, very drawn out apology after apology after apology, it can come off like you're being a little bit insincere. So I think by handling it the way she did, it probably helped her come off as sincere. It honestly also, there is kind of the risk that the more you keep apologizing for it, the more you draw attention to it and then potentially face more career backlash. So I think that she, obviously, I wish she had not made the comment, but I think that she handled it about as best she could in the aftermath. And I've heard criticisms of aspects of the Colbert interview. I'd have to go back and watch the Colbert interview, but it's possible that she could have handled things a little bit better in there. But I think in general, her approach of apologize, admit that she was wrong and try to do better moving forward was the right one. One thing I will say that I do appreciate is it seems to me, as best I can tell, that she avoided those kinds of "I'm sorry if you were offended" apologies, which are not real apologies. It seems like she just flat out admitted that she was wrong, that she made a mistake. And I think that I give a lot of points for that.
I agree. And it's just interesting that I find that the public response to her 2-week suspension has been revealing. I think it says a lot. It's one of those sort of political Rorschach tests in a way, in the same way that when you're looking at those ink blots and what you interpret them to mean says a lot more about you than it says about the actual ink blot itself. In much the same way, people's responses to this controversy say a lot more about them than it does about the controversy itself. I remember trying to think, okay, are there any analogs that I would identify? Any other past instances on the part of any other public figures that I think are analogous to this? And it was only when I was watching on YouTube a different panel discussion about this Whoopi Goldberg incident.
I don't think she should have got suspended. I don't think she should apologize. I don't think she said it to hurt anybody's feelings. I think she was expressing what she truly believed and got forced to apologize.
That I heard someone else bring up an example that I think is analogous. When Kanye West said slavery was a choice. Remember that?
Oh yeah. How could I forget?
But my brother Capone, were you cool when Kanye said slavery was a choice? I mean, just his opinion. I mean, you roll with that. We shouldn't be judged on our opinion.
Hell no.
And when I heard, I forget the guy's name, I think his name is Pierre something, he brought up that example, and I thought, damn it, that's it. How could I not have thought of that myself? There's the analog. Not that that's exactly like what Whoopi Goldberg said about the Holocaust, but it's roughly analogous in the sense that, okay, here you have another historical episode of slavery, and it's something that members of a certain marginalized population are very vigilant about. And we in the Black community are very resistant to anyone trying to downplay or trivialize slavery and its effect on us, past and present.
Sorry to cut you off, but personally, I've never been a fan of slavery analogies, to be honest. I'm not going to lie. I say that probably as a descendant of actual slaves.
I don't know what it is about slavery that makes so many people so willing to just brush it off or sweep it under a rug or act like it was a matter of choice. In much the same way that many folks in the Jewish community are generally very protective in a way of, the whole legacy and meaning of the Holocaust and the need to be vigilant about anti-Semitism as a function of that.
Blacks and Jews, we have so much in common, particularly that we have faced bigotry through the ages. And again, let's hope, Don, that through this moment, we can find ways to work together to face the hate that threatens all of us.
Here was Kanye West saying something about the causes of slavery, or why. In that case, he was in an interview on TMZ with Candace Owens, of all people, at his side. And he was talking about why the slavery lasted as long as it did. He was saying, if it lasted that long, that sounds like a choice. Slavery was a choice because it lasted for 400 years. That means that Black people somehow gave into it or caved into it too easily.
You hear about slavery for 400 years? For 400 years, that sounds like a choice. He was there for 400 years and it's all of y'all.
And it turns out he was trying to refer to mental enslavement and internalized racism and self-hatred and the role that could play in making Black Americans more vulnerable to racial oppression.
It's like we're mentally in prison.
This just shows how shallow Kanye's historical understanding is. If he had phrased it that way, it might never have been controversial, at least not as controversial as it was. But because he phrased it as slavery, that sounds like a choice, it was just hugely offensive on its face, outraged the Black community. I remember I did a whole YouTube video about it. You might recall that.
trivializing slavery or drawing facile analogies between slavery and other things that are really nowhere near as bad as slavery, like taxation or military conscription, for example, that's a great way to get on my nerves.
It was something that also needed to be debunked based on historical facts and analysis, in much the same way that Whoopi Goldberg's remark needed to be debunked and cleared up. The record needed to be set straight, factually, historically. What's interesting is, Kanye wasn't in a position to be canceled in the way that Whoopi, or suspended rather, in the way that Whoopi was, because he didn't say it in a capacity as the host or co-host of a show working for a corporation, a major media corporation. But you could argue, well, he could have been dropped from his label if the controversy had been more severe. He could have been boycotted or whatever. But it's interesting that while there was definitely what I call a backlash against Kanye West's remark, but see, that's the thing. And this actually sort of provides a nice segue into discussing the whole Joe Rogan incident, because I've seen people talk about that in that same comedy hype interview that I just mentioned. The members of that panel were saying, it's just really outrageous that Whoopi Goldberg, who didn't mean any harm, has been suspended for 2 weeks now at ABC. And Joe Rogan has just been exposed for dropping N-bombs over the years in his past interviews on his podcast and making that hideously racist Planet of the Apes remark.
We're going to go see Planet of the Apes. So I look on the iPhone app and it says, okay, take me to this one. And the guy goes, okay. I go, is that in a good neighborhood? He's like, oh, yeah. Guy barely speaks English. He takes us there. We get out and we're giggling. Ooh, we're going to go see Planet of the Apes. We walk into Planet of the Apes. We walked into Africa, dude. We walked in the door and there was no white people. Planet of the Apes didn't take place in Africa. That was a racist thing for me to say. You see what I'm saying? What I'm saying is...
Flies automatically stuck to your head.
And Spotify has explicitly come out and said they don't want to suspend him, cancel him, or whatever, right? My response to that is to say, well, yes, in a cosmic sense, it is unfair. They are getting disparate treatment, Whoopi and Joe Rogan. And I agree that Joe Rogan, if anything, if you're going to cancel or punish anyone for making a racially or insensitive or bigoted remark, I would say Joe Rogan is much more deserving of it than Whoopi Goldberg. Problem is, they work for two different companies. As far as I know, I don't think there is any corporate connection between Spotify and Disney, which is the parent company of ABC. I remember when Disney bought ABC back in the 90s when I was a kid. It would be one thing if this were the same company that treated these two public figures so differently, or even two different companies but owned by the same parent company. Because then you could say, well, come on, you gotta have a more standard, consistent approach to dealing with these incidents. But since these are two completely different companies, if you were to accuse, say, the president of ABC, who I think is an African-American woman herself, and accuse her of coming down so hard on Whoopi Goldberg while Joe Rogan basically gets off scot-free with what I thought was a very disingenuous apology on his part.
There's a clip from 11 years ago. I was telling a story on the podcast about how me and my friend Tommy and his girlfriend, we got really high. We were in Philadelphia, and we went to go see Planet of the Apes. We got dropped off in this all-black neighborhood. And I was trying to make the story entertaining. And I said, we got out, and it was like we were in Africa. It's like we were in Planet of the Apes.
And it was like we were in Africa. It's like we were in Planet of the Apes.
I did not, nor would I ever say that black people are apes, but it sure fucking sounded like that. And I immediately afterwards said,
that's a racist thing to say.
Planet of the Apes wasn't even in Africa. I was just saying there's a lot of black people there.
She could always say, well, you're right, but I can't control what happens to Joe Rogan. He doesn't work for my company. He works for Spotify or has a deal of some kind with Spotify. You have to go talk to Spotify about him and what he deserves. And then you could do the same thing in the opposite direction. If you were to confront Spotify and say, well, how come you didn't punish him as harshly as Whoopi Goldberg was punished by ABC? They could always say, well, we don't think Whoopi Goldberg should have been punished either, but it's not up to us. We don't own ABC. We can only control our dealings with this guy, Joe Rogan, who has a podcast on our platform. So I don't know what your response to the Joe Rogan incident was, but I'd love to hear it.
I had first sort of become familiar with Rogan back in 2015, and I had liked what he had to say on certain issues, and I still like what he has to say on certain issues, but I quickly found that he had, in a lot of ways, very problematic views on issues like race, gender, trans people, etc. And one of the things, it's been very tough to pin down his racial views because I've seen episodes where he has kind of pushed back on some of his more racist guests, like people like Ben Shapiro and Gavin McInnes, and actually sounded halfway reasonable on race issues. I've also seen episodes where he came off as, at worst, extremely ignorant, and at best, an outright apologist for racism. The episode that kind of really had me raising my eyebrows was when he was defending Donald Sterling, and basically saying, well, what did he say that was so horrible? And ironically, his defense of Sterling largely hinged on the fact that Sterling never said the N-word, which, given the controversy that Rogan got into later on, is sort of ironic. I had not been a regular enough listener or viewer to have been very familiar with the Planet of the Apes controversy, but I watched his video where he addressed the controversy and gave his own version of events about why he said it, and it still sounded really bad if we go off of his version of events. So, it's kind of like, I think it's pretty clear to me that he's made some pretty yikesy statements about race, also about trans people. He one of the things that I've been pretty hard on him for is that he heavily promoted the idea. There was a trans woman named Fallon Fox who did MMA for a while, and Rogan was heavily pushing the idea that she was just this unstoppable force in the sport because she was trans and she shouldn't be allowed to compete, etc. When I finally looked at Fox's fight record, she never won a championship in her weight division, and she actually lost to a cis female fighter who also never became a champion and had a fairly average record. So he was being, in my opinion, very misleading about the issue of trans women in sports. And I mean, I've seen other stuff. I mean, he also went out of his way to misgender Fox. He generally has, I think, a pretty backwards attitude toward trans people. Then you get into the issue of vaccines, where where you're dealing with outright factual misinformation that's potentially very dangerous. Now, granted, if you take your medical advice primarily from Joe Rogan, I'm not sure that Spotify can be totally blamed for that. I mean, that seems like that's obviously a dumb idea. But one of the things that, as I understand it, Spotify produces the show. They don't just let him stream it, right? Is that correct?
Could be.
Now, if that's the case, that gets into sort of another, that adds a whole other layer to it, because potentially Spotify, if they're producing the show, would essentially be producing something which is promoting very dangerous medical misinformation. The thing I would kind of liken it to is if somebody had a show where they were basically saying that it was safe for parents to shake babies if they wanted them to stop crying, that would be very alarming, and I think that would go beyond just a simple disagreement, because that would be basically giving pediatric advice that's not only factually wrong but incredibly dangerous. And that's kind of where we're at with the vaccination thing right now, because people, including, contrary to what Rogan says, otherwise healthy individuals who are not getting vaccinated are dying because of it. And they are making it harder for us to get the pandemic under control because they're making it harder for us to get to herd immunity. I do think, though, and I used this phrase last time, there is a part of me that does think that Spotify is going to have to kind of lay in the bed it's made. And that at this point, I do have concerns about attempts to cancel Rogan for kind of the usual reasons about sort of, fueling the martyr narrative. I'm not sure they can get him more name recognition or wealth at this point because he's already so rich and famous. But I do have concerns about sort of it fueling the martyr narrative, against the left.
Over the long haul, I have to question its effectiveness. If you're trying to withdraw your attention from someone or something, yet you're talking about it incessantly on the internet, people are going to be curious about the object of your ire, so they may go and check that out. Cancel culture can kind of backfire and do the exact opposite of what people want it to do.
When I was at Evergreen, I had 400 Twitter followers. Today I have 1/3 I have a YouTube channel with almost 200,000 subscribers. So in some sense, it takes what Heather and I were doing in the classroom at Evergreen and brings it to a much larger audience.
I have mixed feelings about the decision to pull a lot of his episodes, and I have mixed feelings about the decision the campaign to remove his show from Spotify. But I certainly have no sympathy for Rogan in this, and I certainly am not interested in defenses of Rogan, because I think that this situation is virtually entirely his own fault, and he's given critics every like all kinds of good reasons to dislike him and want to show off of Spotify. That's my take.
I tend to agree about that. I mean, I do think he's more deserving, if anything, he's more deserving of cancellation than Whoopi Goldberg, much more.
Oh, for sure. No argument there.
One thing you pointed out was that you mentioned the whole Donald Sterling incidents, which I do remember, but I actually didn't remember that Joe Rogan had spoken out on that in that way. I mean, if you're right that he sort of hung his defense of Donald Sterling on the fact that Sterling didn't use the N-word, I mean, yes, that makes him a complete hypocrite, and his denials of his own racism currently, because he dropped N-bomb after N-bomb, or at least one or two, I think, N-bombs in some of these past videos that have been resurfaced lately. If he earlier was going to say in 2014 that Donald Sterling couldn't be racist or wasn't racist in that instance simply because he didn't use the N-word, and then it emerges later that you use the N-word and you still don't want us to believe that you're racist, that's pretty disingenuous and self-contradictory. I also thought his apology, and I thought Trevor Noah did a good job of dissecting this, his apology and his denial, I know what I said sounded racist, it came across that way, but it wasn't. You said it was racist at the moment. If you look at the video footage of him making that remark about Planet of the Apes, he blurts it out, and then it's like he immediately tries to walk it back because he hears it come out of his own mouth, and it occurs to him, oh crap, that sounded really racist. And then he actually thinks that out loud. He says, oh yeah, that was really racist.
That was a racist thing for you to say.
That was a racist thing for you to say.
And the way he juxtaposes those sentences makes it clear that he's implying that Africa or black neighborhoods are tantamount to Planet of the Apes.
We get out and we're giggling, ooh, we're gonna go see Planet of the Apes. We walk into Planet of the Apes. We walked into Africa, dude. We walked in the door and there was no white people. There was no white people.
So clearly comparing black people to apes, but then wants us to believe years later that somehow he wasn't saying what he actually said. And then even though in the moment he actually admitted at the time, immediately after, that what he said was really racist. And I think it's always a bad sign when a public figure says something that controversial, apologizes for it, and then the apology is that lacking in merit. To me, that just heightens the suspicion that this person is every bit as bigoted or insensitive at best as his or her accusers are making him or her out to be. I think it also strengthens the case that this person deserves to be canceled. There's a larger point that has to be made about cancel culture. You often hear people talk about how it's unfair for one public figure to be subjected to cancellation or a cancellation campaign, whereas other public figures seem to get off scot-free or what have you. But part of the problem with pointing out those apparent double standards or that inequity of treatment is that we're talking about civil society. You're not talking about punishments that are handed down by the legal system or by politicians. I mean, you're talking about public opinion at the end of the day, the court of public opinion. The court of public opinion is self-evidently much more decentralized than courts of law. There is no Supreme Court, the ultimate authority on what the law is, that gets the last word on what the law is and what set of rules and procedures for applying those rules apply across the board. What you're really talking about is a very wild, chaotic public square in which more than 330 million people get to have their own opinions and express their own opinions. And so because it's such a completely decentralized and messy context, you're gonna end up with situations and discrepancies like what we're seeing here between the treatment of Whoopi Goldberg and the treatment of Joe Rogan. You know, again, it would be a different story if they worked for the same company or did business with the same company, or at least with two different companies owned by the same parent company. If Spotify were owned by Disney, along with ABC, for example. But when that's not the case, I don't think you should expect them to be treated the same way. I've seen a lot of people chalk up the different treatment of Whoopi Goldberg and Joe Rogan to racism. right? They'll say, oh, this is white privilege in action. What Joe Rogan said was far more racist than what Whoopi Goldberg said was anti-Semitic. But look, she's getting suspended for 2 weeks and he's getting off scot-free. Well, there is a non-racist explanation for why that's the case, right? And you could argue that in some cosmic sense, there's still an element of white privilege there. And that might be true. But at the end of the day, it's not as if there's a smoke-filled room with bunch of powerful rich white men saying, okay, well, we're gonna stick it to Whoopi Goldberg and give Joe Rogan a pass because she's black and he's white. You have to take into account the fact that these two celebrities work for completely different media outlets. And so there's not going to be necessarily the same standard applied to both of them. And at the end of the day, in the court of public opinion, there are different populations and groups of people who are going to respond differently to different incidents and controversies and perceived provocations, right? All people in the society, especially a society that's as politically polarized as American society is today, they're not all going to react the same way to even the same incidents. Yeah, I think that's something people need to take into account. And that's why I wanted to discuss these two incidents in the same conversation, because I think that because they came so close together chronologically, but also a lot of folks have tied them together and have discussed them sort of in tandem and juxtaposed the treatment of these two celebrities against each other and commented on how unfair it is. And again, I agree in a cosmic sense, it is unfair that he's getting off so easily, relatively easily, for something that was, I think we can agree, much worse than what Whoopi Goldberg said. But again, stems the brakes at the end of the day. That's kind of the way I look at it. But I don't know if you have any final thoughts you wanted to offer before we wrap up the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that it is an unfair situation. I don't think that we can necessarily say that. In fact, I don't think that the decision to suspend Whoopi Goldberg was racially motivated. But we can certainly say that it is unfair that she is getting harsher treatment than Rogan, and I think we can certainly say that Rogan would be much more deserving of some sort of professional consequences. I certainly think there are double standards in how conservatives are viewing these incidents, where I think there are definitely, I would say, probably some conservatives who are defending Rogan that want Whoopi sort of hung out to dry, and I think that that's very much a matter of racism and sexism. But I do think part of that kind of disparate treatment may have something to do with the fact that Spotify's audience, I would say, sort of pulls from probably people of all political persuasions, and Rogan's audience in particular might skew a little bit more right wing. I don't think there are just a ton of conservatives that are watching The View. I would say that The View's audience may be more liberal, and therefore there may have been concerns, whether this is accurate, I'm not sure, because nobody was that I'm aware of was really calling for Whoopi to be canceled. But I could see the suits, so to speak, at ABC and Disney, depending on, and I don't know who sort of handed down the decision that she was going to get suspended. Like, I don't know if Bob Iger made that call personally, or if it would have probably been more the head of ABC. But there may have been concern in the boardroom that, given how liberal The View's audience skewed, that Goldberg's comments would engender more sort of blowback than Rogan's would have on Spotify. In terms of final thoughts, with regards to Goldberg specifically, I think that we have to give individuals the opportunity, when they make a misstatement that doesn't rise to the level of being bigoted, malicious, anything like that. I think we've got to give individuals the opportunity to grow without just endlessly dragging them across the coals. I would say that with regard to Spotify, I think at this point, the better use of energy may be to really try to focus on rebutting as much of what Rogan says as possible, and really sort of criticizing Rogan and not letting him sort of put a positive spin on awful things that he said, because I do have a lot of concerns. First of all, Spotify isn't going to pull his show completely, I don't think, although I said that Georgetown wasn't going to do anything further with Shapiro, so I could be wrong there. But I think that it's also, if we put too much pressure on Spotify to quote unquote cancel Rogan, I think they're going to do something to basically make themselves look good. that isn't actually motivated by any desire to actually set things right. So that's kind of how I see it. I think the Rogan situation is more complicated than the Goldberg situation, but those are my thoughts.
Yeah, it seems it was Kim Godwin, the president of ABC, a Black woman, who personally made the decision to suspend Whoopi Goldberg for those 2 weeks. Although I'm sure it was discussed to some extent with the other suits at ABC, like you said. In a way, I have to choose my words carefully here, but I'm almost glad, for the sake of the intellectual conversation surrounding the issue of cancel culture, I'm almost glad that this happened to a Black public figure, and a widely beloved Black public figure on the whole, like Whoopi Goldberg. Because when the issue of cancel culture comes up, I find there is a tendency on the part of some folks, particularly on the left and the sort of activist class, if you will, and the intelligentsia, to talk as if anyone who complains about cancel culture must be some right-wing bigot or an apologist for right-wing bigotry who just doesn't want to see bigots be held accountable for their bigotry. It's not really that simple. On The View itself, whenever the subject of cancel culture comes up, Whoopi Goldberg's co-host, Sunny Hostin, will often say, I don't even like to call it cancel culture. I prefer to call it consequence culture, because now people who've been getting away with bad behavior for years or even decades are now facing accountability for it.
And you have an issue with cancel culture as well, Sunny, yes?
I do. I have an issue with the term, actually, cancel culture, because I think for far too long, we've let people get away with really bad behavior, and now deemed it that they're being canceled because of their behavior, rather than being held accountable for their behavior. I think it's high time that many people that behave badly, behave poorly, behave in racist manners, be held accountable for it, because there should be consequences to behavior. So rather than call it cancel culture, why not call it consequence culture? Why not call it other things like that? And when you look at it through that lens, then I think that's different. We used to say things were, too PC. Well, I don't know, if you are the subject of the behavior, then perhaps you look at it a little differently, right?
I mean, I think there's something to that. Like I said, I think there are many instances where cancellation, so to speak, is warranted. And I think it makes sense to call that consequence culture. But at the same time, look, it's not as if rich, powerful, white, cis, het people are the only ones who are capable of holding or expressing controversial views and attitudes. There are certain areas where there are many Black people who have certain, I'll just say it, outright bigoted attitudes, whether it's towards gay people, trans people, or, in some cases, even other ethnic groups or immigrant communities or what have you. There are instances where you have heard certain members of the Jewish community or other white ethnic groups make bigoted remarks about African Americans, about people of various backgrounds.
Now, during that visit, the couple received a blessing from Israel's chief Sephardic rabbi, but earlier this year, that rabbi reportedly used a Hebrew term that is considered a derogatory word for Black people and compared them to monkeys. The Anti-Defamation League condemned the rabbi's remarks as utterly unacceptable.
And at the end of the day, bigotry is not something on which people of any one background have some kind of monopoly. And so if you're going to make it easy for any kind of outrage mob to silence powerful, privileged, wealthy white people for uttering controversial remarks or expressing controversial attitudes, that has the potential to backfire. And one other thing I just wanted to mention before I wrap up is, I remember, again, on that same comedy hype discussion, one of the participants, the panelists in the discussion, said something like, it's gotten to a point now where you can't even have an opinion without getting canceled and this, that, and the third.
When you give your opinion and you got to be penalized for it, it's just, what are we coming to now? You can't say nothing. And it's annoying to me.
And he seemed to be suggesting or implying that you don't see this happen when white people make bigoted remarks about Black folks. It was almost as if he was suggesting, why is it that a Black public figure like Whoopi Goldberg is getting caught on the carpet for making this ill-advised remark about the Jewish community when this doesn't happen in the opposite direction? I wanted to take a shotgun to my laptop screen because I was thinking, have you forgotten all about Don Imus? Do the words nappy-headed hose ring a bell? Because last time I checked, Don Imus said that almost 15 years ago, and he lost his show. His show was canceled. And I remember he was back on the air on the radio by the end of 2007. But I think when I looked it up again, it turned out he was back on the air on a different radio station after that controversy sort of blew over. And then, you brought up the Donald Sterling incident. of 2014. You've had other white public figures who got dragged over the years for saying racist things about Black people, from Michael Richards. That happened a few months before Don Imus got himself into hot water. There was Dog the Bounty Hunter, Paula Deen, what's the other one's name? Mel Gibson. You got Ralph Northam, I guess, Virginia politician, a few years ago, put in a blackface incident. It's not accurate to suggest that this only happens when a person of color or a Black public figure in particular says something controversial about a white community or any community other than the Black community. The knife absolutely cuts both ways, and there are many instances in which public figures go down or are canceled or at least threatened with cancellation for saying racist things that are directed against the Black community or other communities of color. So I think that's something that needs to be taken into account as well. But I find a lot of folks have selective memory, honestly. And a lot of folks tend to look at these kinds of incidents through the lens of their own political biases. And I feel like that's a big risk when it comes to cancel culture. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have to look at each individual instance on its own merits, because there's a tendency of people in general who are politically opinionated to only want to cancel those with whom they disagree politically. And it's not the case all the time. And you've seen some instances where certain people have enough integrity, intellectual integrity, to be willing to cancel or at least condemn even those who sympathize with them politically. So it's not as if everyone is a hypocrite about this, but there's a lot of hypocrisy involved that's politically driven. I don't know if you found that to be the case historically with cancel culture.
Oh, for sure, absolutely. Because I'll give you sort of an example on the other side. Is I think that the right really has this thing where they have it in their head that nobody on the left ever gets canceled due to right-wing backlash, that right-wingers never try to get anyone on the left canceled, and that's fundamentally wrong if you look at the examples. And that's wrong whether you talk about people who have been successfully canceled or people that they've tried to cancel. And it's also not true if you look at cases where essentially people have been scared to take a particular stance because of the right-wing backlash. There was a very interesting case a few years ago with the NBA, not usually known for being an organization that is very beholden to conservatives, but they were actually interviewing a player, I believe, for the New York Knicks, a guy named Enes Kanter. And he was basically talking about the fact that at the time, the NBA actually had a policy, and I think the policy is still in place, but not really getting enforced anymore. But at the time, they were enforcing a policy requiring that players stand for the national anthem. And Cantor actually said that if it had been up to him, he would have taken a knee. But clearly, he was afraid of the punishment that would come with doing that. And clearly the NBA in 2017 was afraid of the sort of right-wing backlash that would come if they stopped making players stand for the national anthem. On the flip side, I think with the left, I think that there is a tendency to essentially to kind of apply different standards for kind of members of their own team, and also a tendency on the left to some members of the left. And what I just said also applies only to some members, but I think there's a tendency on some members of the left, on the part of some members of the left, to essentially, whenever somebody brings up an example of cancel culture where it actually did happen, it seems like leftists will often sometimes say, "Oh, well, they had it coming. That person had it coming." And the right kind of does that too, but it really, a lot of it does come down to essentially whether or not the person that is sort of the subject of the controversy is quote unquote on your team. I think that, to give kind of another example, with one of the things I've seen a lot on the right is a tendency to use different definitions of cancellation depending on what suits their narrative. So when they are talking about examples of left-wing cancel culture, they will frequently include individuals who were not subject to any kind of government censorship, did not face legal consequences, didn't get their professional careers ruined, and in some cases even ended up more successful and famous than they were before they were targeted for cancellation. But then when you bring up right-wing examples of cancel culture, they'll then say, oh, that doesn't count because the person wasn't thrown in jail and never heard from again. It's so there's definitely a lot of double standards here. And I do think we need more kind of intellectual consistency when it comes to this kind of stuff. I mean, just like I'm sure that there are conservatives that want Whoopi Goldberg to really get the book thrown at her for what she said, that have no problem with Trump Charlottesville comments. So much of this is treating it like it's a team sport, and I do have a problem with that. But I do think both sides need to be more self-aware of not only their own possible biases and double standards, but also how tactics that they're championing against one individual may be used against other individuals in a way they don't like.
I agree. I think one of the reasons why hypocrisy is so commonplace in human life is because not being a hypocrite takes work. It takes work and it takes self-criticism. Like you said, you have to be self-aware. Making sure that you practice what you preach, or perhaps preach what you practice, requires you to just, first of all, just remember everything you yourself have said or done in the past, which is a very tall order for a lot of people. So first of all, you have to remember everything you've preached and practiced in the past. And then you have to be willing to admit when the two are out of sync with each other, past or present. So that requires doing the work of memory, the work of analysis, and the work of not just the work, but having the intellectual honesty and integrity to be willing to admit when you are contradicting yourself, failing to live up to your own principles or what have you. So I think you're quite right. We need a lot more self-awareness and intellectual consistency on this. But as long as the country is so politically polarized, there's going to continue to be a lot of this hypocrisy on this issue. That wraps up the conversation pretty nicely. So once again, thanks a lot for taking the time to delve into this issue with me. And I look forward to what I'm sure will be many more such conversations, because one thing I love about American society is there's never a dull moment. And there's always something going on in your country that needs to be discussed. So I'm sure we'll be back at it again with the back at it again, as Cardi B puts it, before too long. But thanks for joining me yet again.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Looking forward to many more such conversations.
Same here.